The Oracle's Lie by Lucia Ashford, narrated by BookZoro. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories you enjoy most. We love hearing from our listeners. Chapter 1: The Curse of Sight.
The scent of damp earth, ancient stone, and expensive aggressive cologne always preceded a high alpha. It was a smell that made my skin crawl. A sharp contrast to the suffocating aroma of burning sage and dried lavender that filled the sanctuary.
To the world, I was a holy relic. To me, I was just a golden compass, kept in a cold, velvet-lined cage. "Hold still, Elara," the High Priestess hissed, her bony fingers digging into my shoulders. "The Alpha of the Black Ice Pack hasn't traveled 300 miles through a blizzard for you to flinch like a frightened pup. This pack pays for our silence. Give them their due." I stared at the heavy oak doors, my breath hitching in the frigid air. The sanctuary was an architectural marvel of white marble and jagged glass, designed to catch the moonlight, but today it felt like a tomb. My eyes were covered by a translucent silk blindfold, not because I was blind, but because my gaze was too dangerous to be met casually. I saw the threads of fate, the invisible silver cords that bound one soul to another, pulsing like veins beneath the skin of reality. To most, it was a gift. To me, it was a heavy, exhausting fog that never lifted. The doors groaned open, the sound of iron scraping against stone echoing through the vaulted ceiling. The air in the room didn't just change, it died. Alpha Silas stepped into the sanctuary, bringing the winter with him. His heavy fur cloak was dusted with fresh snow that refused to melt, and even through the silk, I could see the sheer mass of his soul, a terrifying, swirling storm of obsidian and jagged lightning. He didn't just walk, he took possession of the floorboards, his every step a claim on the earth itself. "I am told the oracle can untie what the moon has bound." Silas's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in my very marrow. He sounded like grinding glaciers. "The oracle can see the truth, Alpha," the priestess replied, her voice losing its edge and becoming oily with submission. "If the thread is frayed, she can sever it. But why would the most powerful man in the north want to break his mate bond? A mate is a gift." "A mate is a leash," Silas snapped. He stepped closer, the smell of ozone and pine needles overpowering the sage. I could hear the faint chink of the silver daggers at his belt. "The moon made a mistake. I don't want a mate to protect. I want a successor to lead. My bond is a weakness I cannot afford to have exploited." He stopped directly in front of me. The heat radiating from his massive frame was suffocating, a furnace in the middle of a frozen wasteland. I could see the pulse in his neck, a rhythmic thrumming of power. "Look at him, Elara," the priestess commanded, her hand pressing me forward. I reached up with trembling fingers, my nails catching on the fine mesh of the silk, and pulled the blindfold down. The world rushed in with a violent clarity. Usually when I looked at a wolf, I saw a thin, frayed silver thread leading away from their heart, pointing toward some distant girl in a valley far away. But as my eyes met Silas's, eyes the color of a stormy winter sea, flecked with chips of ice, the air was sucked out of my lungs. There was no distant thread! A thick, glowing silver cord, as wide as a bridge, and pulsing with a frantic, molten golden light, snapped into existence, right in front of my face. It didn't lead out the door. It didn't lead to the north. It was bolted firmly to my chest, right over my stuttering heart. The silver cord hummed, a low frequency that I felt in my teeth. The priestess was waiting, her eyes greedy for a scandal, Silas was staring at me with a cold, analytical hunger, his pupils blown wide, oblivious to the fact that the cord between us was now glowing so brightly it felt like it was searing my retinas.
"Well," Silas demanded, narrowing those predatory eyes. "Where is she? Where is the girl the moon has cursed me with? Tell me her name so I can find her and break the bond before the sun sets."
I couldn't breathe. The gold light of the bond was reflected in his dark irises, yet he was blind to it. If I told him the truth, that the oracle he wanted to use as a surgical knife was actually his other half, he wouldn't just break the bond. He would claim me. He would lock me in his obsidian fortress and use my eyes to win his wars. I would be a trophy, not a woman. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat and forced my voice to be a flat, dead calm. A threat, I whispered, my eyes burning as the gold light of our bond throbbed in protest. The thread is a ghost, Alpha. It leads nowhere. There is no mate. You are alone. Silas froze. The obsidian storm in his soul flared, darkening until it nearly choked the light of the room. For a heartbeat, I was certain he saw the lie written in the sweat on my forehead. But then he let out a sharp, bitter laugh that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Good," he growled, his gaze lingering on my lips just a fraction of a second too long for a man who didn't care. "Then the moon and I are finally in agreement. We have nothing more to discuss." He turned to leave, his cloak snapping behind him like a whip, but as he moved, the silver cord between us tensioned, a physical pull that jerked my body forward. I gasped, my knees hitting the cold marble as I clutched the edge of the altar to keep from being dragged across the floor. He stopped at the door, his hand on the iron handle. He looked back over his shoulder, his brow furrowed in a moment of rare confusion. "Why are you pale, little oracle? And why is your heart beating loud enough for even a human to hear?" "The vision," I lied, my voice cracking as the cord throbbed with a golden light that felt like a scream. It was more final than I expected. He stared at me for a long moment, the air between us thick with a tension neither of us could name, before he stepped out into the snow, leaving me shivering in the dark. Chapter 2: The Price of a Lie. The silence that followed the slamming of the oak doors was heavier than the Alpha's presence had been. It pressed against my eardrums, ringing with the ghost hum of the silver cord that still throbbed between my chest and the empty space where Silas had stood. "You did well, child," the High Priestess murmured, her voice like dry parchment. She didn't notice my trembling hands as I fumbled to tie the silk blindfold back over my eyes. The Black Ice Alpha is not a man one wants to disappoint. His gold will keep our lamps lit through the harshest part of the winter. His gold for my soul, I thought bitterly. I could still taste the ozone of his scent in the back of my throat. "I need to rest," I whispered, my voice sounding brittle even to my own ears. The vision, it was draining. "Go. But remember, Elara, the moon sees through even the darkest lies. If you have misled a high alpha, the sanctuary cannot protect you from his claws." She gave me a long, calculating look before dismissing me with a flick of her hand. I stumbled out of the sanctuary and down the winding stone stairs to my cell. It wasn't a room. It was a limestone box with a narrow cot and a single window that looked out over the jagged cliffs of the north. As soon as the iron bolt slid into place, I collapsed. Ah! Ah! A sharp, searing pain erupted in my chest. I ripped open the front of my white linen tunic, gasping for air. There, right over my heart, was a faint, glowing bruise. The mark of a bond that had been denied. In the world of wolves, to lie about a mate bond was a sin. To try and sever it with a lie was a death sentence. The silver cord wasn't invisible anymore. Even with my eyes closed, I could see it stretching out through the stone walls, disappearing into the blizzard. It was pulling, a constant, agonizing tug toward the north, toward him. I crawled to the basin of ice-cold water and splashed my face, trying to drown out the heat of Silas's gaze. I had to leave. If I stayed here, the High Priestess would eventually notice the mark. Or worse, Silas would realize that his aloneness felt suspiciously like a magnetic pull back to the oracle.
A frantic scratching at my window made me jump.
I opened the latch, and a small, gray owl tumbled in, shivering. It wasn't a bird, but a messenger. Attached to its leg was a scrap of forbidden parchment. He knows you lied, little bird. The North doesn't forget its own. Hide your eyes, or he will use them to see his own reflection. The note was unsigned, but the ink smelled of mountain ash, the mark of the resistance.
My heart froze. If the resistance knew I had lied to Silas, it meant I was no longer just a pawn of the sanctuary. I was a target.
Suddenly, the floor beneath me vibrated. A low, distant howl echoed through the mountains, a sound so full of rage and primal hunger that the glass in my window cracked. It wasn't the howl of a wolf looking for its pack. It was the howl of an alpha who had realized he had been robbed. Silas hadn't even reached the edge of the territory before the bond started screaming at him. I looked at my hands. The tips of my fingers were glowing with a faint, silver light. My power was leaking. The lie was breaking me apart.
I grabbed my cloak and a small satchel of dried herbs. I couldn't be the oracle anymore. If I stayed, I was a slave. If he found me, I was a trophy. But as I reached for the door, the silver cord gave a violent, golden jerk. He was coming back, and this time, he wouldn't be asking for a vision. He would be hunting for the girl who dared to tell a king he was alone. Chapter 3. The Echo of a Howl. The crack in my window pane was a spiderweb of silver under the relentless glare of the moonlight. A perfect, jagged reflection of how my life had shattered in a single hour. I stood frozen in the center of my cell, my lungs burning as if I had swallowed shards of the very ice that coated the sanctuary's exterior. That howl, Silas's howl, still vibrated in the marrow of my bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical weight, a primal claim that stripped away the layers of civilization until only the raw, pulsing nerve of a prey animal remained. It hadn't been a call for his pack. It had been a roar of discovery, a signal to the mountains that he had tasted a lie, and he was coming back to tear the truth from the liar's throat. "Patience, Elara," I whispered, the words puffing into a pale cloud of mist in the frigid air. "Breathe. If you can't breathe, you can't think. If you can't think, you're already dead." But my hands refused to listen. They shook with a violent rhythm, the kind that comes when the soul realizes the body is no longer safe. I turned to the small, cracked ceramic basin on my washstand. The silver glow that had lit my fingertips earlier was fading into a dull, bruised gray, but the mark over my heart, the spot where the mate bond had struck me like a lightning bolt, was darkening. It was no longer just a bruise. It was an angry, swirling nebula of violet and gold, pulsing in time with the thrumming of the silver cord that stretched out through the stone walls and into the blizzard beyond. Every time Silas moved a mile closer, the cord tightened. It was a physical tug, a magnetic pull that threatened to drag me through the solid masonry. I reached for a hidden jar tucked behind a loose stone near the floor. It contained a paste of crushed nightshade, charcoal, and congealed animal fat, a mixture I had secretly prepared months ago, whispered about in the forbidden texts, as a way to dampen the magical scent of a gifted wolf. My fingers trembled as I smeared the black sludge over the mark on my chest.
The pain was instantaneous and searing. I gasped, my knees buckling as the chemicals reacted with the raw magic of the bond. It felt like liquid fire being poured into an open wound, a chemical gag for a spiritual scream. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, refusing to let even a whimper escape. In the sanctuary of the moon, silence was the only armor I had ever known. To cry out was to admit to a sin, and the High Priestess was a woman who fed on the sins of others. A soft, rhythmic scratching at my door made me startle so violently I nearly overturned the basin. I scrambled to pull my tunic back up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs.
Elara, it is Sister Martha. The voice was thin and weathered, like the rustle of dry leaves. Martha was the only soul in this tomb of marble who didn't look at me as if I were a holy relic or a golden prize. I slid the heavy iron bolt back just a few inches, the metal screeching in the quiet night. The old nun stood in the corridor, her face a map of deep wrinkles illuminated by the flickering light of a single tallow candle. She held a tray with a bowl of thin, watery broth, but her eyes, clouded by cataracts yet unnervingly sharp, didn't look at the food. They looked directly at the sweat beading on my forehead. "The Alpha's departure has left the mountains restless," she murmured, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. She set the tray on my rickety wooden stool, her movements slow and deliberate. "The wind has changed, child. It no longer smells of snow. It smells of iron and blood." "It is a storm, Martha," I said, my voice sounding like brittle glass. "Nothing more." "Do not lie to a woman who has spent 60 years listening to the stones of this mountain," Martha whispered, leaning in. The scent of candle wax and unwashed wool clung to her. "The High Priestess is in the archives. She is not sleeping. She is unrolling the scrolls of the First Age, the ones that speak of oracles who tried to hide their own hearts. She is looking for the ritual of the unseeing." My blood turned to ice. The unseeing. It was a legend whispered among the novices. A ritual where an oracle's eyes were physically removed to purify their vision, turning them into a permanent, unmoving conduit for the moon's will. "She thinks I lied," I breathed, the black paste on my chest throbbing in agreement. "She knows you are hiding something," Martha corrected. She reached into the deep, shadow-filled pocket of her robe and pulled out a small, hand-stitched leather satchel. "Because your mother was my friend before the sanctuary claimed you, I will give you this one mercy. Take it. It contains mountain ash, rowan berries, and the salt of a dried tear. It won't hide your soul from him forever, but it will confuse the scent of a tracker. It creates a fog where there should be a trail." She pressed the satchel into my palm. Her hand was dry and surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the cold marble world I lived in. "He is coming back, Martha," I whispered, the weight of the silver cord giving a sudden agonizing jerk. "He never truly left," she replied, her eyes mournful. "The Black Ice Alpha has the soul of a winter storm. He does not ask for what he wants. He simply freezes everything until it shatters. And tonight, he smells something in the air that he cannot dominate. Rage is a powerful motivator, Elara, but obsession is what burns the world down to the roots." When she left, the room felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. I was alone with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. I began to pack with a frantic, focused energy. My movements were a blur. I didn't have much. A sturdy pair of fur-lined boots I had stolen from the laundry months ago,
a heavy wool cloak the color of a winter twilight, and a small, rusted knife I used for cutting herbs in the sanctuary garden. I moved to the window and looked out. The drop was staggering, 60 feet of sheer limestone before hitting the jagged slope of the mountain. Far below, the pine trees of the Whispering Woods looked like black needles piercing the white shroud of the snow. There was a narrow goat path, little more than a ledge of ice, that wound its way down toward the valley.
If I could reach the woods, the ancient, heavy magic of the cedar and pine might muffle the vibration of the bond. In the forest, the world was chaotic. Perhaps there, a single thread of silver would be lost in the shadows. I climbed onto the ledge, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face like a lash. The cold was a physical blow, a reminder that the world outside didn't care for my title or my safety. Below, in the distance, I saw them. A line of torches was moving with impossible speed across the white expanse of the valley floor. They weren't following the main road. They were cutting through the drifts, heading straight back toward the sanctuary gates. Silas wasn't waiting for the storm to pass. He wasn't waiting for the morning. He was hunting through the dark, guided by a pull he likely didn't understand but couldn't ignore.
With a final, silent prayer to the moon, a goddess I had served but no longer trusted, I gripped the frozen stones of the buttress and stepped off the ledge.
The world became a rush of white noise and gravity. My fingers screamed as I clung to the icy handholds, my body a dark smudge against the white mountain. Every inch of progress was a battle against the wind that tried to peel me off the rock. But as I descended, the silver cord gave a violent, golden thrum, nearly shaking me loose. He was at the gates. I reached the goat path, my boots crunching into the crusty snow. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I turned toward the darkness of the trees and ran, the black paste on my chest burning a hole through my tunic, and the golden cord stretching thinner and thinner, screaming for me to stop. I was no longer the Oracle of the North. I was a ghost in the snow, and the hunt had officially begun. Chapter 4: The Breath of the Wild. The transition from the sterile, incense-choked halls of the sanctuary to the Whispering Woods was like being submerged in a bucket of ice water. The wind didn't just blow. It bit, tearing through my wool cloak as if it were nothing more than a spider web. My lungs felt brittle, each breath a crystalline explosion in my chest. I was halfway down the goat path when the first roar reached me. It wasn't a howl this time. It was the sound of iron meeting stone, the sound of the sanctuary's great gates being forced off their hinges. Silas had arrived. Even from this distance, I could feel the ripple of his power, a cold, static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. The silver cord between us, dampened by the nightshade paste, groaned like a bridge cable in a hurricane. He is there, in my cell, touching my bed. The thought sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. I didn't just run. I scrambled, sliding down the last 20 feet of the icy slope and tumbling into a snowdrift at the edge of the tree line. The forest was a different kind of darkness. Inside the sanctuary, the dark was hollow and silent. Here, it was alive. The pines groaned under the weight of the snow, and the shadows seemed to shift with a predatory intent. I had spent my entire life behind stone walls, looking at the world through visions. To actually feel the frozen needles under my boots, to smell the damp rot of autumn leaves beneath the snow, it was overwhelming. I stumbled deeper into the thicket, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to get off the main trail. Silas would have his trackers out within minutes. Wolves of the Black Ice Pack could scent a drop of blood in a blizzard from 5 miles away. "Hide me," I whispered, pressing my hand against the rough bark of an ancient cedar. "Please." Suddenly, the silver cord gave a violent golden flash in my mind's eye. Back at the sanctuary, Silas was standing in the center of my room. I saw it through our connection, a fractured, involuntary vision. He was holding my silk blindfold in his massive, gloved hand. His face was a mask of lethal calm, but his eyes were glowing with a terrifying intensity. He looked at the cracked window, then at the High Priestess, who was cowering in the corner.
"Where is she?" His voice boomed through the bond, vibrating in my very teeth. "Boo-hoo!"
I choked back a sob and broke the connection, forcing my mind back to the forest. The effort left me dizzy. My magic, usually so contained and directed by the rituals of the priestesses, was leaking out of me like water from a cracked jar. The temperature was dropping. If I didn't find shelter, the forest would kill me before Silas even had the chance. I found a small hollow beneath the roots of a fallen spruce, a natural cave of dirt and ice. I crawled inside, my limbs heavy and numb. I was losing the battle against the cold. My fingers were turning a dangerous shade of blue, and the shivering had stopped, a sign that my body was giving up.
"I am an oracle," I thought, my vision blurring. "I command the light of the moon. I cannot freeze like a common animal." I reached deep inside myself, past the fear, past the lie, to the well of power I had been taught to fear. In the sanctuary, we were told that our magic was a gift to be offered, never used for ourselves. To use it for personal gain was the path of the heretic.
Well, I thought grimly, I'm already a fugitive.
I pressed my palms together, focusing on the violet and gold mark over my heart. I didn't try to summon a vision of the future. Instead, I reached for the heat of the bond itself. If the bond was a fire that burned my soul, I would use it to warm my blood. "Ignite!" I hissed through chattered teeth.
For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a spark. Not a physical flame, but a surge of golden energy that radiated from my chest. It was the raw, unfiltered essence of the mate bond, the energy that was supposed to sustain a pair through the harshest winters. The air in the small hollow began to shimmer. The frost on the roots melted into glistening droplets. I felt the warmth spread through my veins like hot wine, thawing my frozen joints. But there was a price. The moment I tapped into that energy, the silver cord flared like a beacon.
Far away, at the edge of the mountain, I heard a sharp, focused howl.
He felt me.
Silas had felt the flare of my power. He now had a direction. He was no longer searching. He was following the thread.
I pulled my knees to my chest, the golden warmth keeping the frost at bay. I knew I couldn't stay here long, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't just seeing the future, I was feeling the present. The forest was breathing with me. I could hear the heartbeat of the mountain, the slow tectonic pulse of the earth. I closed my eyes, exhausted. Back at the sanctuary, Silas stood on my balcony, staring into the dark woods. He didn't need a trail. He didn't need the High Priestess's directions. He reached out and caught a snowflake on his tongue, his eyes fixed exactly on the spot where I lay hidden miles away. "Run as far as you like, little bird," he whispered into the wind, his voice carried to me through the golden cord. "The more you use that power, the more of me you let inside." I shivered, but this time it wasn't from the cold. I had survived my first night in the wild, but I had accidentally invited the predator into my mind. Chapter 5, The King of Obsidian.
The scent of burning sage was starting to smell like a funeral pyre. I stood in the center of the oracle's cell, the air so cold my breath came out in jagged plumes. But the cold wasn't coming from the open window. It was radiating from me. My wolf was pacing beneath my skin, a restless, snarling shadow that wanted to tear the white marble of this place down to the dirt.
"She is a child of the moon, Alpha," the High Priestess whimpered from the doorway. She was trying to sound authoritative, but her heartbeat was a frantic, staccato rhythm against my eardrums. "Her visions are erratic. She must have been confused. The thread, it can be fickle."
"The thread is not fickle,"
I growled, my voice sounding like tectonic plates grinding together. "The girl is a liar." I reached out and picked up a scrap of translucent silk from the floor. Her blindfold. It was still warm with the ghost of her heat, smelling of dried lavender and something else. Something sharp, metallic, and terrifyingly familiar.
"Ozone! The smell of a storm! My storm!"
I closed my eyes, crushing the silk in my fist. The moment our eyes had met in the sanctuary, the void in my chest, the one I had spent 15 years hardening into ice, had shattered. I had expected a frail girl, a puppet for the priestesses. Instead, I had found a mirror, and she had looked me in the face and told me I was alone.
I walked to the washstand. My eyes fell on a loose stone near the floor. I didn't need a vision to know it was a hiding spot. I could smell the bitter, toxic tang of nightshade and charcoal. I pried the stone loose with a clawed finger, revealing a jar of black sludge.
"Haha, nightshade," I muttered, a dark laugh bubbling in my throat. She didn't just lie, she camouflaged herself. She knew exactly who I was, and she chose to run.
The priestess stepped forward, her greed momentarily outweighing her fear. If she has fled, she has forfeited her protection. My gold, Silas. Our agreement. I turned on her so fast she hit the wall. I didn't touch her, but the sheer pressure of my Alpha command pinned her in place. The shadows in the room deepened, swirling around my boots like ink. "You kept her in a cage,"
I said, my voice a low, lethal silk. "You told me she was a tool, a surgical knife to cut my weakness away. But she isn't a tool, is she? She's the other half of the storm, and you let her walk out that window into a blizzard that will kill a human in an hour."
"She is an oracle. The moon will—" "The moon didn't give her boots and a knife," I snapped. "She stole those. She's been planning this for months."
I stepped onto the balcony, the wind whipping my fur cloak. I closed my eyes and reached out. Most wolves felt a mate bond as a gentle tug, a north star to follow home. Mine felt like a barbed wire wrapped around my heart, pulling with such violence it threatened to rip the organ from my chest. Then, it happened! A flare, a blinding golden explosion of heat erupted in my mind, miles away to the south, deep within the whispering woods. It wasn't a vision, it was a heartbeat, a scream of power so raw that it lit up the darkness of my soul like a lightning strike.
There you are. The bond hummed, a low, predatory frequency. She was using the energy between us to stay warm. She was feeding on my power to survive the very night I was hunting her through. The irony would have been beautiful if it wasn't so infuriating. "Cain! Varric!" I roared. Two shadows detached themselves from the stone pillars of the courtyard below, my best trackers. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. They could feel the killing frost radiating from me. "The girl is in the whispering woods," I commanded, jumping from the balcony and landing silently in the deep snow, 60 feet below. I didn't shift. I didn't need to. My human form was already more beast than man. We cut through the black pass. No torches. No noise. "And the priestess?" Cain asked, his eyes glowing amber in the dark. I looked back at the sanctuary, a jagged tooth of glass and lies. If the oracle is dead when I find her, come back and leave no stone standing. But if she lives,
I paused, feeling the golden thrum of her magic leaking into the air, inviting me in, whispering of a heat I had never known.
If she lives, she belongs to the north now, not to the moon. I turned toward the forest, my blood turning to molten lead. She thought she was a ghost in the snow, a bird escaping its cage. She didn't realize that by tapping into the bond, she had given me the leash she so desperately feared. And I was going to pull.
Chapter 6. The Shadow in the Snow. The warmth was the first thing that felt wrong. It wasn't the golden heat of the bond I had summoned to save my life. This was a dull, earthy heat, the smell of wet fur, wood smoke, and old copper. I opened my eyes, but the world was a blur of charcoal shadows. I wasn't in my spruce hollow anymore. The ceiling above me was jagged stone, dripping with slow, rhythmic condensation. I tried to sit up, but my body felt like it had been dismantled and put back together with rusted nails. "Don't," a voice rasped. It was a low, sandpaper sound, devoid of the oily submission of the sanctuary priests or the glacial power of Alpha Silas. "You've leaked enough silver to light up half the valley. If you move, the wound will open again." My hand flew to my chest. My tunic had been pulled back, and the black paste I had applied was gone, wiped away. In its place was a poultice of chewed leaves and bitter bark. The mark, my bruise of fate, was pulsing a faint, sickly violet. "Who are you?" I croaked, my throat feeling like I'd swallowed glass. A figure moved in the corner of the cave, stepping into the weak light of a dying ember fire. He didn't offer a name. He wore a patchwork of furs and leather, and a bow carved from bone leaned against the wall behind him. He looked like the mountains themselves, gray, weathered, and dangerous. "A pathfinder for those the world has forgotten," he said, narrowing eyes the color of flint. He tossed a wooden flask toward me. "Drink. It's mountain ash and pine needle. It'll keep your scent from drifting." I didn't touch the flask. I pulled my cloak tighter around me, my pulse thrumming with a new kind of fear. This wasn't the sanctuary, and he wasn't a wolf, but he felt like a predator all the same. "You sent the owl, the letter." "I sent the warning," the Pathfinder corrected, his gaze unblinking. "I know more about you than you know about yourself, Elara. I knew your mother's face before the sanctuary scrubbed her memory from your mind. I knew the exact hour you would break, and I knew you would be foolish enough to lie to a king." A chill that had nothing to do with the snow crawled down my spine. He knew my name. He knew my mother. He was a collector of secrets I hadn't even discovered yet. "How?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "How could you know any of that?" "The resistance has eyes even in the shadows of the moon," he said, leaning forward. His presence was suffocating. "You are a very expensive problem. The High Alpha didn't just follow you. He's tearing the mountainside apart. He's not hunting a mate anymore. He's hunting a thief."
"Silk! I didn't steal anything!" I snapped, though I recoiled as he reached for a small obsidian knife on the ground.
"You stole him," the Pathfinder said, his voice cold. "You're an oracle. You were supposed to be the one thing in this world that couldn't lie. When you told Silas he had no mate, you didn't just lie to a wolf, you insulted the moon herself. And now, the bond is turning toxic because you've denied it." He pointed to my chest. The silver cord wasn't a bridge anymore. It was a frayed, vibrating wire, thrumming with a tension that made the stones of the cave vibrate. Is that why Silas can see me? I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't trust this man. He looked at me as if I were a map to be read, not a person to be saved. Partly, the Pathfinder said, sharpening the obsidian blade, but mostly because you're his. The Resistance. We thought we could use you. We thought an oracle who hated the sanctuary would be an asset, but you're not an asset yet. You're just a beacon leading a monster to our door. I looked at my hands. The silver glow was still there, faint but persistent under my fingernails. I was trapped. If I stayed, Silas would claim me. If I followed the Pathfinder, I was just swapping one cage for another. Suddenly, the air in the cave grew heavy. The fire didn't go out, but the flames flattened, turning a strange bruised blue. The silver cord gave a violent, agonizing jerk, pulling my torso forward. "He's at the river!" I gasped, clutching my stomach as the phantom smell of ozone and aggressive cologne filled my senses. He's in the water." The Pathfinder stood up, grabbing his bow in one fluid motion. His face went pale. He hadn't expected the Alpha to be this fast. "The river is 5 miles away. If you can feel him that clearly—" "He's not just following the scent," I realized, terror cold and sharp as a needle. "He's inside the bond. He's using my eyes to see the shadows of this cave." The nameless man cursed, kicking snow over the embers to kill the light. "Then we move. Now, if he catches us in this hole, it becomes our tomb." He reached down and hauled me to my feet. His grip was like iron, and I tried to pull away, but I was too weak. As we moved toward the dark back tunnels of the cave, I felt a whisper in the back of my mind. A gravelly, ice-cold voice that didn't belong to the wind. "I see the stone, little bird. I see the dark. Don't let him touch you. You are mine to punish." I didn't tell the Pathfinder. I didn't trust him any more than I trusted the Alpha. I just ran, caught between 2 hunters in a forest that wanted us all dead. Chapter 7. The Shattered Sight. The river was a vein of liquid ice, black and jagged against the white throat of the valley. I didn't slow down. I waded into the current, the freezing water slamming against my thighs like a physical blow. Most men would have been swept away, their hearts stopping from the sheer shock of the cold. But my blood was boiling. Every inch of my skin felt like it was being scraped by 1,000 tiny electrified needles. "Alpha, the current is too fast! We should find the crossing 2 miles up!" Kane shouted over the roar of the water, his breath a frantic cloud. "No!" I growled, the word tearing out of my throat like a snarl. I didn't have 2 miles. I didn't have 10 minutes. The bond was no longer a tug. It was a rhythmic, agonizing pulse that was rewriting my very biology. With every step I took through the rushing water, the world around me began to flicker. One moment, I saw the black water and the gray granite of the riverbank. The next, darkness, cold stone, the smell of wet dirt and old copper. I stumbled, my boot slipping on a mossy rock. My wolf surged beneath my skin, confused, clawing at the insides of my skull. It wasn't just my scent she had stolen. It wasn't just my future. She was stealing my focus. I saw a man's hand, rough, scarred, holding a wooden flask. Not my hand, a stranger's. "Get out of my head!" I roared at the empty air, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Alpha!" Varric called out, his voice laced with an edge of fear I hadn't heard in years. "What is it?" I ignored him, my fingers clawing into the ice-slicked bank as I hauled myself out of the river. I stood there, dripping, the wind turning my sodden furs into a coat of armor. I was a high alpha of the Black Ice Pack. I was a man of logic, of iron,
of absolute control. I had led wars without breaking a sweat. But this was a violation.
Every time Elara blinked, my own vision hitched. I could feel her terror like a cold stone in my stomach. I could feel the thrum of her heart, too fast, too fragile, vibrating against my own ribs. Our souls were folding into one another, and I was losing the boundaries of where Alpha ended and the Oracle began.
It made me want to kill. It made me want to howl until the mountains crumbled. I closed my eyes, trying to force her out, but that only made it worse. With my eyes shut, her world became mine. I felt the rough grip of the man hauling her to her feet. I felt the recoil of her body, the way she shrank away from his touch.
Good, my wolf hissed, a dark, possessive heat blooming in the center of my chest. Don't let him touch you. You are mine to break.
She's not alone! I spat, the words tasting like iron. There is a man with her, a scent I don't recognize. Mountain ash and old blood. The resistance? Cain asked, stepping up beside me, his hand moving to the hilt of his blade. If they have the Oracle, they'll head for the deep tunnels. We'll lose the scent in the limestone. I don't need the scent, I snapped. I grabbed my head, my temples throbbing as a fresh wave of her exhaustion washed over me. The control I prided myself on was slipping through my fingers like sand. I was a king, yet I was being dragged through the mud by the ghost of a girl's fear. It was an indignity I couldn't tolerate. I wanted to find her and shake her until the connection snapped. I wanted to lock her in a room made of lead just so I could have my own thoughts back.
I see the stone, little bird, I thought, projecting the words into the golden bridge that connected us. I didn't know if she could hear me, but I poured all my rage, all my frustration, and all my strange, terrifying hunger into the link. I see the dark. Don't let him touch you. You are mine to punish.
I felt a jolt of pure crystalline fear from her end, a sharp spike that nearly brought me to my knees.
Move!
I commanded the trackers, my eyes glowing a feral, unearthly blue. She is entering the tunnels. If that nameless shadow takes her where I cannot see, I will burn every forest from here to the border to smoke her out.
I started running, my pace predatory and relentless. I didn't care about the cold. I didn't care about the exhaustion. I was a hunter who had finally tasted the blood of his prey, and even if it cost me my sanity, I was going to reclaim my sight.
Chapter 8. The Hollow Heart. The tunnels felt like the throat of a dying god, cold, damp, and smelling of ancient earth. I stumbled, my boots slipping on the slick limestone floor. Above us, the mountain groaned under the weight of the blizzard, but here, the only sound was the frantic rasp of my breathing and the steady, rhythmic footfalls of the Pathfinder.
Suddenly, my vision flickered. I saw a flash of gray fur and the spray of river water. I saw my own reflection in a dark pool, but through his eyes, Silas. I gasped, slamming my shoulder against the jagged tunnel wall.
Stop, the Pathfinder hissed, his hand gripping my arm like a vice. He didn't look back, but I could feel his irritation. You're vibrating with his energy. You're like a bell he keeps ringing. He's right behind my eyes, I whispered, squeezing my lids shut. He saw the cave. He sees the stone. He knows we're in the tunnels. The nameless man stopped. He turned around, the faint bioluminescent moss on the walls casting a ghostly green pallor over his features. He didn't look afraid. He looked clinical. Then keep them shut. An oracle who cannot control her sight is just a beacon for the wolf. If you want to survive the next hour, you have to learn to look inward, not out.
I don't know how,
I cried, the desperation finally breaking through my mask of calm. In the sanctuary, they taught me to be an open door. They never taught me how to lock it.
The Pathfinder let out a short, bitter laugh. Of course they didn't. Why would a jailer teach the prisoner how to hide the key? They wanted you open, Elara. Not for the moon, but for the gold.
He started moving again, deeper into the dark, pulling me along. "Shh, what do you mean?" I asked, my heart hammering. The High Priestess said my service was a tithe to the goddess, that my visions kept the North in balance. The North is in balance, because the Alpha of the Black Ice Pack keeps it so, he said, his voice echoing in the narrow space. The sanctuary is a business. Do you know what happens to an oracle when she grows too old to see? Or when she starts asking questions about the threads she sees? I thought of Sister Martha. I thought of the way she had looked at me, with pity, not reverence. They undergo the ritual of the unseeing. That's the lie they tell the novices, the Pathfinder said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. There is no purification ritual, little bird. They don't take your eyes to help you see better. They take them because a blind oracle is easier to sell to the highest bidder. Your mother didn't leave you at the gates because she wanted you to be holy. She left you because she was running for her life, and she thought the one place they wouldn't look for a rebel's daughter was in the goddess's lap. The world tilted. The stones beneath my feet felt like they were turning to water. A rebel's daughter? The resistance isn't just a group of hunters, he said, stopping at a fork in the tunnel. He looked at me, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Your mother was the first to realize that the high alphas and the sanctuary were colluding to control the bloodlines. They use oracles to find mates that consolidate power, not love. You were never meant to find Silas's mate. You were meant to find him a political asset. I clutched the satchel Martha had given me, the salt of a dried tear, my mother's tear. Then why did the bond snap into place? I asked. If it's all a game of power, why is he tied to me? The Pathfinder went silent for a long moment. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering near the mark over my heart. I flinched, but he didn't touch me. Because the moon has a sense of irony, he muttered, or because you are the one variable they couldn't calculate. A girl who can see the truth, tied to a man who only wants to destroy it. Suddenly, the air in the tunnel grew deathly still. The green moss dimmed. From the darkness behind us, a low, vibrating hum began to resonate through the limestone. It wasn't a sound, it was a frequency. Elara. The voice was inside my skull, a tectonic rasp of ice and obsidian. Silas was close, so close I could feel the cold water dripping from his furs, as if it were on my own skin. He's here, I breathed, my pupils blowing wide in the dark. The Pathfinder didn't waste another word. He grabbed my waist and shoved me into a narrow, vertical crevice in the rock. Climb, and for the sake of your soul, keep your eyes closed. If you look at him through the bond now, you'll give him the map to this entire mountain. I climbed into the dark, my fingers bleeding against the stone, while the echo of a predator's heartbeat filled the silence of the deep. Chapter 9, The Altar of the Lost. The crevice was so narrow it felt like the mountain was trying to swallow me whole. My fingernails were raw, the stone biting into my skin as I hauled myself upward behind the Pathfinder. Below us, the tunnels remained silent, but it was a predatory silence, the kind that exists right before a lightning strike. He stopped moving, I whispered, my voice echoing hollowly against the wet rock. I can't feel his footsteps anymore, just his breath. It feels like frost on the back of my neck. He hasn't stopped, the Pathfinder grunted.
reaching down to pull me onto a wider ledge. He's just realized that the tunnels are a labyrinth. He's hunting by instinct now, not by sight, which means we have less time than I thought. I collapsed onto the cold stone, my chest heaving. The silver leak from my power was dimming, replaced by the throbbing violet ache of the denied bond.
Where are we going? You said the Resistance wanted an asset. You said you knew my mother. Tell me the truth before I take my chances with the wolf.
The nameless man stood at the edge of the ledge, looking out over a massive underground cavern we had just entered. In the center stood a jagged spire of obsidian, surrounded by a ring of ancient, crumbling pillars. "We are going to the Iron Root," he said, gesturing to the spire. "It's a place where the veins of the earth are so thick with iron that even the moon's light cannot penetrate the stone. It is the only place where we can perform the severance."
My heart skipped a beat! The severance?
"You think you can just run forever?"
He turned to me, his flint-colored eyes hard. "As long as that gold cord is attached to your soul, Silas owns your heartbeat. He will find you in a week, a month, a year."
"The Resistance needs an oracle who is free. We need your eyes to see the movements of the High Alphas, to predict the purges before they happen. But we can't use a compass that always points to the enemy's chest." I looked at the obsidian spire. It looked like a needle designed to pierce the soul. "You want to break the bond? Martha said that trying to sever it with a lie was a death sentence."
"A lie is a clumsy blade," the Pathfinder said, stepping closer. "But ancient magic, performed in the heart of the Iron Root, it can snip the thread without killing the host. Or so the scrolls say."
Or so the scrolls say!
I recoiled, my back hitting the damp wall. "You want to experiment on me? You're no better than the High Priestess."
The priestess wanted to sell you, he snapped, his voice echoing through the cavern. I want to use you to win a war. Your mother died trying to find this place, Elara. She knew that as long as the Alphas could use oracles to claim their destinies, no one in the North would ever be free. You are the key to breaking the cycle.
Suddenly, a violent shiver racked my body. It wasn't from the cold. A vision, sharp, cold, and terrifyingly vivid, tore through my mind. I saw a hand, dripping with black river water, slamming into the very rock ledge I was sitting on. I saw the flash of blue, feral eyes. Silas wasn't 5 miles away. He wasn't even 1. "He's here," I choked out, the silver cord in my chest tightening so hard I felt my ribs groan. "He found a shortcut. He's right below us." From the darkness of the shaft we had just climbed, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards of the mountain. It wasn't the sound of a wolf. It was the sound of a man who had reached the end of his patience.
Elara!
The voice rasped, vibrating in my very teeth. Silas was using the bond like a megaphone, his voice echoing inside my skull. "Step away from the shadow. If he touches you again, I will strip the skin from his bones while he still breathes." The Pathfinder drew his bone bow, his movements blurred with speed. He pointed an arrow tipped with mountain ash directly at the mouth of the shaft.
"Choose, little bird," the nameless man whispered, his eyes never leaving the darkness. "The king who will cage you, or the needle that will set you free. But decide fast. The storm has arrived."
I stood between the obsidian spire and the edge of the pit, my heart a frantic bird, as the smell of ozone and pine needles filled the cavern, drowning out the scent of the earth. Chapter 10: The Obsidian Stand. The air in the cavern didn't just turn cold. It turned heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by the weight of a coming avalanche.
The Pathfinder stood, as still as the stone pillars surrounding us, his bone bow drawn to its limit. The mountain ash arrow hummed with a faint, anti-magical light. He was a man prepared to kill a god, or at least the closest thing the North had to one. Then, a hand emerged from the lip of the dark shaft. It was massive, the knuckles scarred and bleeding, fingers digging into the limestone with a strength that turned stone to dust. With a violent, fluid heave, Silas hauled himself onto the ledge. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a nightmare birthed from the ice. His furs were shredded, soaked through with the black water of the river, and his eyes, gods, his eyes, were no longer sea storm gray. They were glowing with a feral electric blue that cut through the cavern's gloom like a blade. "Stay back," the Pathfinder warned, his voice steady, despite the creature standing 10 feet away. "Another step and I put ash through your heart. Even an alpha doesn't walk away from a poisoned soul."
Silas didn't even look at the bow. His gaze was locked on me, pinning me against the obsidian spire. The silver cord between us was no longer a thread. It was a roaring conduit of gold light, vibrating so hard I could hear it echoing off the walls. "Elara," Silas said. His voice wasn't a growl. It was lower, a jagged rasp that held a terrifying amount of restrained violence. "Come here."
"She's not going anywhere with you," the Pathfinder snapped. "She's a free woman of the Resistance now, not a trophy for your mantle." Silas finally turned his head, his lip curling into a sneer that revealed elongated canines. "A free woman? You bring her to a place of torture, to a needle meant to flay her spirit, and you speak of freedom? You smell of desperation and old lies, little man." "I am saving her from the leash the moon put on her!" "You are trying to break a force you don't understand." Silas stepped forward, ignoring the arrow pointed at his chest. "If you snip that thread in this place, you won't just free her, you will leave her a husk. An oracle without a soul is just a vessel for whatever darkness crawls into her first."
I looked between them. The Pathfinder, who offered a freedom that felt like a lobotomy, and Silas, who offered a claim that felt like a cage.
"Silas, stop!"
I found my voice, though it sounded thin and fragile.
"You shouldn't be here. You said a mate was a leash. You said you wanted to break the bond."
Silas halted, his chest heaving. The ozone scent of him was overwhelming now, mixing with the metallic tang of the iron root. I wanted a successor, Elara. I wanted to lead my pack without the distraction of a heart. But the moment you looked at me, the moment you lied to me, you became the only truth I've ever wanted to hunt. He reached out a hand, palm up. It was trembling, just a fraction. The bond is screaming, because you are denying it. It is toxic, because you are trying to suffocate it with ash and shadows. Let me touch you. Let the magic ground itself, or it will burn you from the inside out.
"Don't listen to him!" the Pathfinder yelled. "The moment he touches you, the claim is complete. You will never see the sun without his permission again."
"Better a cage with a soul than a grave without one," Silas countered, his voice softening into something dangerously seductive. "Choose, little bird, the needle or the storm." The tension snapped. The Pathfinder, sensing my hesitation, released the arrow. It hissed through the air, a streak of white light aimed directly at Silas's throat. Time seemed to liquefy. Silas didn't dodge. He caught the arrow mid-air, the mountain ash searing his palm with a hiss of burning flesh. He didn't even flinch. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the cavern, he lunged. "Ah!" "No!" I screamed. "I didn't think!" I threw myself between them,
my hands reaching out blindly. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the bond.
The moment my fingers brushed the wet, freezing fur of Silas's cloak and the rough leather of the Pathfinder's tunic, the world exploded. A shockwave of golden and violet light erupted from my chest, a physical manifestation of the denied mate bond finally finding an outlet. It wasn't a vision. It was a blast of pure, raw divinity. The Pathfinder was thrown backward, his bow shattering against the stone. Silas was knocked to his knees, his head snapping back as the gold light flooded his senses. And I felt the ceiling of my mind break open. For the first time, I wasn't just seeing one thread. I saw them all. I saw the mountain's veins, the Pathfinder's history of blood, and Silas's future of fire. The golden cord between us solidified, turning from a vibrating wire into a thick, glowing pillar of light that illuminated every dark corner of the iron root. Silas looked up at me, his face pale, the blue fire in his eyes fading into a look of absolute, terrifying wonder. "Oracle," he whispered, the word a prayer and a threat all at once.
I stood over them both, my hair swirling in a wind that didn't exist, the light from my chest blinding. I wasn't a fugitive anymore, and I wasn't a trophy. I was the storm. Chapter 11. The Weight of the Sky. The roar of the explosion was still ringing in my ears, but it was quickly replaced by a sound far more terrifying. The mountain was screaming.
Dust and jagged shards of limestone rained down from the vaulted ceiling of the iron root. My knees buckled. The golden light that had turned me into a sun moments ago vanished, leaving me hollow, as if someone had reached inside and scooped out my very soul. I began to fall, the cold floor rushing up to meet me, but the impact never came. A pair of massive, iron-strong arms caught me, the scent of ozone, wet fur, and something deep and grounding, like ancient earth, surrounded me. I looked up through blurred vision and saw Silas. His face was no longer a mask of predatory hunger. It was etched with a look of stunned, raw reverence. "Steady, little bird," he murmured. His voice wasn't a growl. It was a low vibration that seemed to hold my fractured pieces together.
Behind us, a boulder the size of a carriage slammed into the spot where I had stood seconds ago. The obsidian spire cracked, the sound like a bone snapping in the dark. "The blast!" I choked out, my head lolling against his shoulder. "I broke it! I broke the mountain!"
"You did more than that," Silas said, his eyes scanning the collapsing cavern. He looked at me, really looked at me, not as a tool, not as a prize, but as a force of nature that had just brought a king to his knees. A few meters away, the Pathfinder groaned, pushing a slab of rock off his legs. His bone bow was splinters, and blood trekked down his forehead, but his eyes were sharp with survival. He looked at Silas, then at me in Silas's arms, and he didn't reach for a knife. He knew the hierarchy of the world had just shifted.
"The iron root is unstable!" the Pathfinder shouted over the thunder of falling stone. The blast triggered a tectonic shift. If we don't move toward the lower vents, we'll be buried in a tomb of our own making. Silas stiffened, his protective instinct warring with his hatred for the nameless man. He could have taken me then. He could have knocked the Pathfinder into the abyss and carried me away as a prisoner. I felt the tension in his muscles, the roar of the Alpha wanting to claim the win. But then a massive crack spiderwebbed across the ceiling directly above the Pathfinder. "Ha! Ha! Move!" I screamed. Silas reacted before I could finish. With one arm still firmly anchoring me to his chest, he reached out with his free hand, grabbing the Pathfinder by the scruff of his furs and jerking him forward just as a ton of rock pulverized the ground where he'd been lying. The three of us stood in the center of the chaos. A king, a rebel, and an oracle, bound by a sudden, desperate necessity.
"The vents are blocked," Silas growled, his eyes glowing blue as he calculated the exits. "We have to go up through the spire's fracture. It's the only path left." I can't walk," I whispered, the exhaustion finally pulling me into the gray. "You don't have to," Silas said. He shifted his grip, hoisting me against his chest with a gentleness that felt foreign to his massive frame. He looked at the Pathfinder, his expression returning to one of lethal cold.
You know these tunnels. You lead. If you lead us into a dead end, I will ensure you are the first thing the mountain crushes. Agreed, the Pathfinder spat, wiping blood from his eyes. But keep your wolf in check, Alpha. If you lose your footing, we all die. We moved as a fractured unit. The Pathfinder scrambled over the shifting debris, his hands finding grips in the dark that only a man of the shadows could know. Silas followed, his strength a terrifying anchor. Every time the earth shook, he shielded my body with his own, his back taking the hits from falling gravel and shards of stone.
I watched the golden cord between us. It wasn't screaming anymore. It was humming, a steady, rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of his heart. "Why?" I managed to ask, my voice a ghost against the fur of his cloak. "You could have just taken me." Silas didn't look down. He jumped across a widening chasm, his boots slamming into the far ledge with bone-shaking force. A wolf hunts a rabbit because he is hungry, Elara, but he respects the storm because it is his equal. You are not a rabbit, and I am tired of hunting in the dark. As we reached the upper fracture, a gust of freezing fresh air hit us. The blizzard was still screaming outside, but for the first time, it sounded like freedom. We tumbled out onto a high, jagged ridge, the sanctuary a distant, glowing ember on the mountain peak behind us. Behind us, the entrance to the iron root collapsed with a final, deafening boom, sealing the secrets of my mother and the needle of the severance forever. Silas set me down in the snow, but he didn't let go. He stayed on his knees beside me, his large hand resting on my shoulder, grounding me as the world spun. The Pathfinder stood a few feet away, his bow gone, his mission failed, watching us with the wary eyes of a man who knew the rules had changed. "The hunt is over," Silas said, looking not at the Pathfinder, but at the gold cord pulsing between us in the moonlight. "But the war for who you belong to, that has only just begun." Chapter 12. The Shelter of Secrets. The ridge was a knife's edge of black rock and howling white wind. We were high enough that the air was thin, tasting of nothing but ice, and the metallic tang of my spent magic. Silas didn't ask for permission. He scooped me back into his arms, his body a wall of heat against the biting gale. He looked at the Pathfinder, who was shivering, his patchwork furs stiffening with frost. "Find us a hole," Silas commanded, "or I'll use your carcass to block the wind." The nameless man didn't argue. He led us along the leeward side of the peak until he found a shallow overhang, a cold pocket cave, barely large enough for the three of us to crawl into. It wasn't warm, but it stopped the wind from flaying our skin. Inside, the silence was deafening. Silas sat against the back wall, keeping me tucked between his legs, his heavy cloak wrapped around us both. The Pathfinder sat opposite of us, his hands tucked into his armpits. "The iron root is gone," the Pathfinder said, his voice a jagged rasp.
The only place in the north where the bond could be safely cut is buried under 1,000,000 tons of limestone. You're stuck with him now, little bird.
I'm not stuck. I saw the threads, Silas. I saw yours. You didn't just want a mate. You wanted a weapon.
Silas went still. His hand, which had been resting on my hair, tightened, almost imperceptibly. I wanted an end to the chaos, Elara. My pack is falling apart. The High Priestess promised me an oracle who could stabilize the north. She didn't tell me I'd be tied to a girl who could shatter a mountain.
Because she didn't know, the Pathfinder interjected, a ghost of a smirk on his face. The sanctuary suppresses the power of the daughters of the resistance. They keep them hungry, tired, and blind. They wanted you to be a mirror, Elara, reflecting only what they wanted Silas to see.
Silas looked at the nameless man, his blue eyes narrowing. You know too much for a common scout. You knew her mother. You knew about the Iron Root. Who are you serving?
I serve the memory of a woman who was smarter than both of you, the Pathfinder said. He reached into a hidden pocket and pulled out a small, charred piece of wood, not a weapon, but a relic. Elara, your mother didn't just run. She was the one who mapped these tunnels. She knew the High Alphas were using oracles like livestock to breed stronger wolves, more compliant seers. She wanted to break the system.
He looked at Silas with pure, unadulterated loathing. And here you are, the great Alpha, proving her right, holding her daughter like a prize. I am holding her so she doesn't freeze to death!
Silas roared, the sound causing a small trickle of dust to fall from the cave ceiling. Are you? I whispered, looking up at Silas. The gold cord was glowing softly now, a steady amber light that bathed the small cave. Or are you holding me because you're afraid of what I am without you? The question hung in the freezing air. Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. The bond was feeding him my emotions, fear, budding curiosity, and a strange, flickering spark of something that felt dangerously like trust. It was a sensory overload that bypassed his ironclad logic.
We can't stay here, I said, her voice gaining strength. The High Priestess will send her seekers, and now that the mountain has moved, the other Alphas will have felt the surge. They'll be coming to see who has the power to shake the earth. She's right, the Pathfinder said. We're not the only ones who saw the sun rise underground.
Silas shifted, his grip turning from protective to possessive. Let them come. My pack is 3 days' march from the base of this ridge. If we can reach the Black Pass, we'll be on my territory. And then what? I asked, my eyes searching his. Do I go from one cage in the sanctuary to another in your fortress? Silas leaned down, his face inches from mine. The ozone scent was gone, replaced by the smell of wood smoke and a dark, heavy musk. In the sanctuary, you were a tool. In my fortress, you will be the Alpha's mate. There is no cage for the woman who shares my throne.
War! I don't want a throne,
I said, my voice cold.
I want the truth about my mother, and I want to know why the moon chose a monster to be my match.
Silas flinched, as if I'd struck him. He looked at the Pathfinder, then back at me. The truce was holding, but it was as thin as the ice on the ridge. Then we make a pact, Silas said, his voice a low vibration. The 3 of us. We reach the Black Pass together. I keep the Seekers off your back, and the Pathfinder tells us everything he knows about the Resistance and your mother's maps. And me? I asked. You, Silas said, his hand moving to the mark over my heart, his touch surprisingly warm.
You learn to use that storm inside you, because when the other alphas realize what you are, I won't be enough to protect you. You'll have to be the one who burns them down.
Outside, the wind changed. The blizzard began to thin, revealing a sky full of cold, uncaring stars. The hunt had transformed into an exodus, and the Oracle was no longer just a girl. She was the prize in a war that had only just begun. Chapter 13, The Crimson Frost. The first light of dawn was not golden. It was a bruised, sickly violet that bled over the horizon, illuminating the devastation we had left behind. The ridge was a jagged spine of obsidian and ice, and as I stepped out of the shallow cave, the world felt too large, too bright, and far too dangerous. My body ached with a hollow, echoing fatigue, but the silver leak had stopped. In its place, the bond with Silas felt like a warm, heavy chain, not quite a cage, but no longer a wound. Silas was already standing at the edge of the precipice, his back to us. The wind caught his heavy fur cloak, making him look like a statue carved from the mountain itself. He didn't turn when he heard my boots crunch on the frozen crust. "The air is changing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The sanctuary has stopped hunting with scouts. They've released the Seekers."
Beside me!
The Pathfinder stiffened. He was busy checking the string of a makeshift bow he'd fashioned from a sturdy branch of mountain cedar during the night. "Seekers? The priestess is getting desperate. They aren't men. They're shadows bound to silver. They don't sleep, and they don't lose a trail." "Then we don't give them a trail to follow," Silas said, finally turning. His blue eyes scanned me, lingering on the mark over my heart. "Can you walk, Elara?" "I have to," I said, though my legs felt like lead. We began the descent. It was a brutal trek. The Pathfinder took the lead, his eyes constantly darting to the shadow maps he kept in his mind, guiding us through narrow chimneys and hidden ledges that kept us out of sight from the valley below. Silas remained at my back, a constant, looming presence. Every time I stumbled, his hand was there, a brief, burning touch on my elbow or waist that sent a jolt of unwanted electricity through my spine. By mid-morning, we reached the base of the ridge, where the vertical stone gave way to a dense, ancient forest known as the Weeping Pines. But as we stepped off the last shelf of rock, the Pathfinder came to a dead halt. "Look," he whispered, pointing his cedar bow toward the tree line. "The forest wasn't green or white. It was crimson." A thick, crystalline frost covered the trees, but it wasn't made of water. It looked like frozen blood. The needles of the pines were coated in jagged red ice, and the ground was littered with the carcasses of small forest creatures, squirrels, birds, even a fox, all frozen in mid-stride, their bodies turned to translucent, ruby-colored glass. "What is this?" I breathed, reaching out toward a branch.
Don't touch it! Silas roared, grabbing my wrist and pulling me back so hard I hit his chest.
"It's a blood blight trap," the Pathfinder said, his voice trembling with a rare flash of fear. "The sanctuary didn't just send seekers. They've invoked the goddess's wrath. They've poisoned the very ley lines of the mountain to keep us bottled up." The red frost was spreading. I could see it moving, creeping across the snow like a slow-motion wave of rust. It was a magical barrier, designed to react to my specific frequency, the frequency of an oracle. If I stepped into it, my magic would crystallize my own blood from the inside out.
"They're forcing us toward the Great Road," Silas growled, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "Into an ambush."
"We can't go through it, and we can't go back up. I said, feeling the walls of the world closing in again. Silas looked at the red frost, then at me. A dark, reckless light flickered in his eyes. He let go of my wrist and stepped toward the crimson line.
Silas, no! It will kill you!
It won't, he said, his voice dropping into that predatory, alpha tone. This magic is tuned to you, Elara. It's looking for the light of the moon, but it's not looking for the shadow of a wolf.
He reached into his belt and pulled out a heavy obsidian dagger. Without hesitating, he sliced a shallow line across his palm. He didn't flinch as the dark, thick blood welled up. He stepped into the red frost and slammed his bleeding hand against the trunk of a crimson tree.
The reaction was violent. The red frost hissed, turning black where his blood touched it. The goddess's wrath recoiled from the raw, primal essence of a high alpha's blood, a power that was older and more grounded than the sanctuary's refined spells.
It's a bridge,
Silas gasped, the effort of fighting the magic making the veins in his neck stand out. He was forcing the blight to part, creating a narrow, gray path through the sea of red.
Move! Now! I can't hold the gap for long!
The Pathfinder didn't wait. He sprinted through the gap. I hesitated, looking at Silas. His face was contorted in pain, his sweat freezing on his brow as the blight tried to crawl up his arm.
Elara, run!
He roared. I ran. As I passed him, I grabbed his other hand, trying to pull him with me. For a second, our eyes met, not as hunter and prey, but as two souls drowning in the same storm. We broke through the other side of the crimson grove, collapsing into the normal, white snow. Behind us, the red frost slammed shut, the path Silas had carved vanishing instantly. Silas fell to one knee, clutching his blackened, burned hand. The blight had left jagged, dark scars across his skin, but he was alive. "You're a fool," I whispered, kneeling beside him, my hands shaking as I reached for my satchel of herbs.
I told you,
Silas rasped, his eyes finding mine through the pain. In my fortress, you will share the throne. I don't let my throne turn to glass.
Not at your fortress yet,
the Pathfinder reminded us, pointing toward the dark canopy of the weeping pines. And the Seekers just heard that explosion of magic. We have 3 miles to the Black Pass, and the forest is already starting to scream. Chapter 14. The Silver Mask. The forest of weeping pines lived up to its name. The branches, heavy with thick, resinous sap, sagged toward the earth like mourning veils. But the sound wasn't wind. It was a low, rhythmic sobbing of wood and needle. Silas was faltering. The Alpha, who had hauled himself up a mountain and waded through ice water without a shiver, was now leaning heavily against a trunk. His breath was a ragged, wet sound in the stillness. The hand he had used to break the blood blight was no longer just blackened. The skin was marbleized with dark violet veins that were crawling up his forearm toward his heart. "You're burning up," I whispered, reaching for his forehead.
He caught my wrist, his grip still strong, but his palm was clammy and slick with cold sweat. "I'm fine. Keep moving."
"You're not fine," the Pathfinder snapped, stopping a few paces ahead. He looked back with a mixture of clinical interest and genuine concern. The blight doesn't just burn, it's a parasite. It's feeding on your alpha essence. If we don't mask his scent now, the Seekers won't even need to track us. They'll just follow the smell of your dying magic.
Silas let out a jagged laugh that turned into a cough. "I'm not dying in a pile of pine needles." "Then let me help,"
I said, stepping into his space. I didn't wait for his permission this time. I placed my hands on his chest, right over the center of the bond. The moment I touched him, a jolt of his agony spiked through me.
It felt like swallowing needles. I could feel the blight inside him, a jagged, artificial cold that was trying to freeze his blood.
The Seekers are close, the Pathfinder whispered, his head cocked toward the ridge. I can hear the silver chains rattling. They're coming from the north and the east. We're being pinched. I can't heal him yet, I realized, my heart hammering. Not without a flare that would light us up like a bonfire. I have to hide us instead. I looked at the weeping pines. The sap was thick, smelling of turpentine and ancient secrets. In the sanctuary, we were told that the sap of these trees was the tears of the moon, a natural conductor of magic.
Pathfinder, help me, I commanded. My voice had a new edge to it, one that made even the nameless man move. I need the resin from the oldest trees, the ones that have seen the most winters. The Pathfinder understood immediately. He used his obsidian knife to score the bark of the surrounding giants, collecting the amber-colored sludge in a hollowed piece of wood.
I turned back to Silas. He had slumped against a root, his eyes half closed, the blue fire in them dimming to a dull charcoal. I'm going to do something the priestesses call the silver mask, I told him, kneeling between his knees. It will feel like I'm drowning you. You have to trust me. Silas's eyes flickered open, searching mine. Trust is a dangerous word, Oracle.
So is death, I retorted.
I took the resin and began to chant, not the hollow prayers of the sanctuary, but the older, guttural songs my mother had whispered in my dreams. I mixed the sap with a handful of clean snow and a drop of my own silver-tinted blood. The mixture began to glow with a soft, moonlight-gray luminescence.
I began to smear the paste over Silas's face, his neck, and finally over the blackened veins on his arm. As the resin touched his skin, it didn't just sit there. It began to harden into a shimmering, translucent film. It looked like he was being encased in a chrysalis of moth wings and silver.
The effect was instantaneous. The roar of the mate bond in my head dropped to a dull hum. The heat he radiated disappeared. To any magical tracker, Silas had just ceased to exist. He was now just another tree in a forest of shadows.
I applied the mask to the Pathfinder, and finally to myself.
Quiet, I breathed. The forest went silent. Then, the sound began. Clink, clink, clink.
From the mist between the pines, 3 figures emerged. They didn't walk. They drifted, their feet never quite touching the snow. They were tall, draped in tattered silver robes that looked like funeral shrouds. Where their faces should have been, there were only smooth, featureless masks of polished silver. Long, jagged chains of blessed metal trailed behind them, frost fire flickering along the links. One of the Seekers stopped exactly 5 feet from where we sat huddled under the spruce. Its head tilted, the silver mask reflecting the dark trees. It was looking for the gold of the bond, the silver of the oracle, and the heat of the Alpha.
But all it saw was resin and stone. Silas breathed out, a slow, silent exhale. I felt his hand find mine under the cloak. His fingers were cold, but he squeezed, a silent acknowledgement of the girl who had just hidden a king from his own gods. The Seeker stood there for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, then turned and glided back into the mist, the rattle of its chains fading into the weeping of the trees. We waited until the last echo died away. I reached out to peel the mask from Silas's arm, but he caught my hand. The violet veins were still there, but they had stopped moving. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, a strange mix of debt and dawning obsession. "You hid me from the moon," he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former power.
I hid us, I corrected, though we both knew the truth.
The pass is close, the Pathfinder said, his voice barely a breath. But the blight is reaching his heart. If we don't get him to your territory by sundown, Silas won't be a king anymore. He'll just be a statue of red glass. The Black Pass was not a road. It was a wound in the world. 2 massive pillars of basalt rose like the ribs of a giant, arching over a narrow, windswept gorge that served as the only gateway into the High Alpha's territory. But the gateway was not empty. "Trees," the Pathfinder hissed, pulling us behind a jagged outcrop of rock. At the mouth of the pass, 4 warriors stood guard. They weren't the ethereal seekers of the sanctuary. These were wolves of the Black Ice Pack, massive, scarred men clad in plate armor the color of a starless night. They held halberds tipped with silver, their eyes glowing a low, predatory amber through the slits of their helms. Silas slumped against the stone, his skin gray, the violet veins of the blood blight now tracing a roadmap of poison up his neck. He tried to push himself up, his muscles twitching with a phantom strength that wasn't there. My men," he rasped, his voice a dry rattle. "They'll let us through." "Silas, look at them," I whispered, my heart sinking. The sentries weren't standing in a defensive line for their king. They were searching. They were checking the scent of every gust of wind with a lethal, suspicious intensity. "They aren't waiting for a king," the Pathfinder muttered, his eyes narrowing. "They're waiting for a corpse. Word has traveled fast. An alpha who can't walk is an alpha who can be replaced." The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. I felt it through the bond, a spike of betrayal so sharp it made my own chest ache. He wasn't just fighting the blight, he was fighting for his crown. I have to show them," Silas groaned, his hand clawing at the rock.
You can't even stand, I said, stepping in front of him. I looked at the golden cord. It was frayed, dimmed by his sickness, but it was still there. You told me I had to be the one to burn them down. You told me I wasn't a rabbit. I looked at the Pathfinder. Give me your knife. He hesitated, then handed me the obsidian blade. I didn't use it on the guards. I sliced a thin line across my own palm, letting the silver-tinted blood of an oracle drip onto the snow.
"What are you doing?" the Pathfinder breathed.
I'm giving them a vision they can't ignore. I stepped out from behind the rock. I didn't hide. I didn't cower. I walked into the center of the pass, my red cloak billowing behind me like a splash of blood against the white. Halt! The lead sentry roared, leveling his halberd at my throat. State your name or be shredded by the frost. I didn't speak. I closed my eyes and reached for the storm I had discovered in the iron root. I didn't try to shatter the mountain this time. I reached for the connection. I pulled on the gold cord with everything I had, dragging Silas's waning alpha essence into my own light.
I opened my eyes, and I knew they weren't human anymore. They were burning with a blinding, celestial gold.
I am the Oracle of the North, I said, my voice amplified by the canyon walls until it sounded like the mountain itself was speaking. And I carry the soul of your king.
I raised my bleeding hand. The silver blood didn't fall to the snow. It rose, spinning into a shimmering, holographic mist. Within the mist, the image of a great white wolf began to form, majestic, terrifying, and wreathed in blue fire. It was Silas's spirit, projected through my power.
The sentries recoiled. The sheer pressure of the magic, the combination of oracle light and alpha authority, forced them to their knees. Their halberds clattered against the ice.
The king returns, the lead sentry choked out, his head bowed in terror and awe. Open the gate, I commanded. They scrambled to obey, hauling back the massive iron chains that barred the path. I turned back to the rocks. Silas was watching me, his face a mask of disbelief. He managed to stand, leaning heavily on the pathfinder, his eyes fixed on me with a new kind of hunger, not for a tool, but for a partner.
We crossed the threshold.
The moment we passed the pillars, the air changed. The weeping of the pines was gone, replaced by a sharp, clean scent of cedar and frozen iron. This was the obsidian land. The sky was darker here, the stars more brilliant, and the mountains looked like teeth designed to guard a secret. As we reached the outskirts, a small, fortified village of stone houses tucked into a valley, the exhaustion finally claimed me. The gold light faded from my eyes, and the spectral wolf vanished. I began to collapse, but this time it was Silas who caught me, even as he himself was falling. We went down together in the snow at the edge of his kingdom. You did it, he whispered into my ear, his breath smelling of the blight, but his grip as firm as the earth. You burned them, little bird. You're home, I murmured, though I didn't know if the word meant safety or a new kind of danger.
From the village, torches began to flicker. A howl went up. Not a hunt, but a herald. The High Alpha had returned, but he had brought something with him that the Black Ice Pack was not prepared for. He had brought the storm! Chapter 16. The Bitter Salt.
The village of Kale's Hold was a cluster of granite and bone, huddled in the shadow of the peaks like a pack of wolves seeking shelter from a gale. It wasn't the ethereal, silent beauty of the sanctuary. It was a place of iron, blood, and the constant low thrum of wood being chopped and blades being whetted. The moment we were carried past the perimeter walls, the air turned toxic with suspicion.
He's black-veined, a woman hissed, pulling her child back into the shadows of a doorway. The blood blight. He brings the goddess's curse into our hearths. Silas was barely conscious, his head lolling against the furs of the litter the sentries had fashioned. Beside him, I walked with a spine of ice, my red cloak stained with the silver of my own blood. Every eye in the village was a needle, stitching me into a tapestry of fear. To them, I wasn't a savior. I was the heretic who had led their king into a trap. "Quiet!" a voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs like a frost axe.
An older man stepped forward. He was massive, his beard a tangle of gray and iron, and his eyes were the same piercing charcoal as Silas's. He wore the heavy silver collar of the pack elder, the keeper of the laws. "Elder Torin," the pathfinder muttered, his hand instinctively going to the empty space where his bow should have been, the most stubborn wolf in the north.
Torin looked at Silas, then at the blackened veins on his neck, and finally at me. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a greeting. He spit into the snow at my feet. "An oracle," Torin growled, the word sounding like a curse. "The sanctuary hasn't sent a priestess over the Black Pass in 50 years. Why does this one smell of ozone and treason?" "She saved his life," the Pathfinder said, stepping forward. "She led the Seekers to our door," one of the sentries countered, his voice trembling. "She used a magic I've never seen, a wolf of light. It wasn't holy. It was wrong." I stepped forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my voice remained steady. "Your Alpha is dying. The blight has reached his collarbone. If you waste another minute debating my holiness, You won't have a king to bury." "Bold, for a girl in a cage of her own making. Take the Alpha to the healer's hall. And the girl," he paused, his gaze raking over my gold and violet mark. "Lock her in the iron tower. If he dies, she follows him into the pyre. That is the law of the bond."
"No!" I shouted, but the sentries were already moving. They didn't touch me with the reverence they showed the Alpha. They grabbed my arms with hands of iron, dragging me away from Silas. Through the bond, I felt a sudden, frantic surge of his consciousness, a flicker of blue fire in the dark. "Elara." His voice was a ghost in my mind, weak and desperate. "Don't let them."
"Silas!" I screamed, but he was gone, carried into the stone hall as the heavy iron doors of the tower slammed shut behind me. The iron tower was little more than a cold chimney of rock. There was no bed, only a pile of moth-eaten furs and a narrow slit in the wall that looked out over the village square. I paced the floor, the golden cord in my chest feeling like a tether that was being pulled too thin. I could feel him. 200 yards away, they were washing his wounds with salt and mountain ash. I could feel the sting of the salt, as if it were on my own skin. I could feel the healer's doubt, the way she looked at the violet veins and whispered that there was no cure for the goddess's wrath.
"They're going to let him die," I whispered to the empty room. "They think it's the moon's will." Suddenly, the lock on the door ground open. I spun around, expecting Torin or a guard. Instead, the Pathfinder slipped inside, his face pale and urgent. "The Elder has called a council," he whispered. "They aren't trying to heal him, Elara. They're preparing for a succession. Silas's second in command, a man named Hakon, is already claiming that the bond is a sign of Silas's madness. He says the moon has rejected Silas by giving him a broken oracle."
"I have to get to him," I said, grabbing the Pathfinder's tunic. "I can draw the blight out. I saw how to do it in the Iron Root. I can use the bond as a siphon."
"If you do that, you'll take the poison into yourself," the Pathfinder said, his eyes hard. "You'll die for a man who wanted to cage you."
"I'm already in a cage," I hissed. "But if he dies, this whole pack burns, and the sanctuary wins. My mother didn't fight so I could die in a hole, because I was too afraid to be the storm." The Pathfinder looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He reached into his furs and pulled out a small, jagged piece of obsidian, the same stone from the Iron Root. "The village is distracted by the council," he said. "The guards are at the Great Hall. If we move now, we can reach him. But Elara..." He gripped my shoulder. "If you do this, there's no going back. You won't just be his mate. You'll be his life force. You'll be tied to him in a way even the sanctuary couldn't imagine." "Good," I said, my eyes flashing with that new, dangerous gold. "Let them see what a broken oracle can do." Chapter 17. The Siphon.
The healer's hall smelled of death, not the sudden, sharp end of a blade, but the slow, rotting sweetness of a body surrendering to a curse.
I slipped through the shadows with the Pathfinder, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The guards were gone, drawn to the great hall by the sound of Hakon's booming voice as he began the rites of succession. They thought Silas was already a ghost.
"Hurry," the Pathfinder whispered, staying by the door to watch the corridor.
I stepped toward the center of the room. Silas lay on a slab of cold stone, stripped to the waist. He looked smaller than he had in the woods. The violet veins had reached his jawline, pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic light. His skin was the color of ash. I sat on the edge of the stone and took his hand. It was cold, deathly cold. "I told you I wouldn't let my throne turn to glass," I whispered, my voice trembling.
I suppose that means I can't let my king turn to it either.
I took the shard of obsidian I was given before and pressed it against my own palm. I didn't slice deep. I didn't need to. I needed a bridge. I pressed my bleeding hand against the blackened veins on his chest, right over his heart, and closed my eyes.
Ignite!
The bond flared, but instead of the golden warmth of the woods, I was met with a wall of violet ice. The blood blight didn't want to leave. It was a parasite, and it had found a host it liked. I reached deep into the silver reservoir of my soul, grabbing the threads of his life and pulling.
Give it to me!
I hissed through clenched teeth. Give me the poison. The transition was a physical agony. It felt like someone was pouring molten lead into my veins. I felt the blight jump from his skin to mine. The violet lines began to recede from his jaw, flowing down his arm, across our joined palms, and into my wrist. Ah! I screamed, but the sound was caught in my throat. My vision turned silver, then purple, then black. I could feel Silas's heart beneath my hand, stuttering, then slowing, then suddenly, a massive, thunderous thud. The Alpha's heart found its rhythm. At the same moment, the blight hit my own heart. I gasped, my back arching as the cold took hold of me. I felt the silver light of my magic trying to fight the violet rot, the two powers warring inside my chest.
Elara?
The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Silas's eyes snapped open. The gray was gone, replaced by a blue so bright it looked like the sky was falling. He sat up with a violent jolt, his hand flying to his chest, then to mine. He saw the violet veins crawling up my arm. He saw the obsidian shard. He saw the sacrifice.
What have you done?
He roared, but there was no anger in it, only a terrifying, desperate panic. He grabbed my shoulders, his strength returning in a terrifying wave as the poison left his system. I leveled the scale, I managed to whisper, before the world began to tilt. The heavy oak doors of the hall burst open. Elder Torin, Hakon, and a dozen warriors charged in, their blades drawn for a coup. They stopped dead. They saw their High Alpha standing over the stone slab, bare-chested and glowing with a lethal predatory health. And they saw the oracle slumped in his arms, her skin marbleized with the very curse that should have killed him. "Silas!" Hakon stammered, his sword dipping. "The healer said, she said you were gone." Silas didn't look at them. He didn't even acknowledge the threat. He pulled me against his chest, his head bowing until his forehead touched mine. The gold cord between us was a blinding, solid bar of light now, anchoring my fading soul to his resurgent one. "You were wrong, Hakon," Silas said, his voice dropping into a register that made the stones of the hall vibrate. He looked up at the council, his eyes burning with a promise of slaughter. The moon didn't reject me. She gave me her most dangerous weapon. He stood up, carrying me as if I weighed nothing. He walked toward the men who had come to depose him, and for the first time in the history of the Black Ice Pack, the warriors didn't just step aside. They fell to their knees. "The Oracle has taken the blight," Silas announced to the room, his hand tightening around mine. "She has bled for your king. From this moment on, her word is my law. Her life is my life, and anyone who looks at her with anything less than total devotion will answer to me in the old ways." I felt the violet cold in my chest settle into a dull, manageable ache. I wasn't dead, but as I looked at Silas, at the way he looked at me, with a mixture of terror, debt, and a love that felt like a war, I knew the Pathfinder was right. There was no going back. I had traded my cage for a storm.
Chapter 18. The Price of a Heartbeat.
The Alpha's private chambers were a sanctuary of dark oak, heavy furs, and the scent of cedar smoke. Outside, the village was a hornet's nest of hushed whispers and howling wolves, but inside, the silence was thick enough to choke on.
Silas had refused to let the healers touch me. He had carried me here himself, dismissing his guards with a look that promised death to anyone who crossed the threshold.
I sat on the edge of the massive bed, my head spinning. I looked down at my right arm. The violet veins hadn't disappeared. They had settled into fine, shimmering lines that looked like lightning trapped under my skin. They pulsed in time with my heart, or perhaps his. "Drink this." Silas appeared beside me, his voice a low, rough rumble. He handed me a chalice of dark wine, laced with honey and mountain herbs. I took it, my fingers trembling. As our hands brushed, a jolt of pure, unadulterated heat sparked through the bond. It wasn't the searing agony of the siphon. It was something deeper, a magnetic pull that made my breath hitch. "You should be resting," I whispered, looking up at him. He was standing too close. He had changed into a clean tunic of charcoal wool, but he hadn't put on his cloak. The blue fire in his eyes was muted now, replaced by a dark, simmering intensity that I couldn't quite name. "I have spent my life taking," Silas said, ignoring my comment. He sat on the edge of the bed, his weight shifting the mattress, drawing me toward him. "Taking territory, taking lives, taking power. I was prepared to take you too. I thought you were a prize to be won, or a tool to be mastered." He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering over the violet scars on my arm. He didn't touch them at first, as if he were afraid they would burn him. "But no one has ever given for me," he continued, "especially not a girl who had every reason to watch me die."
"I didn't do it for you,"
I lied, though the golden cord between us hummed with the truth.
"I did it for the North, for the people who would have died in the civil war Hakon wanted."
Silas gave a small, humorless smile. He closed the distance, his fingers finally settling on my scarred skin. The contact was electric. The violet lines on my arm glowed a soft, ethereal purple, reacting to his touch. "You are a terrible liar, little bird," he murmured. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. It was the same gesture from the hall, but without the audience. The intimacy was suffocating. I could smell the ozone on his skin, the sharp scent of the winter air still clinging to his hair. "The siphon didn't just move the poison," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. "It moved the barrier. I can feel your thoughts, Elara. I can feel the way your heart races when I'm near. I can feel the fear and the hunger." I wanted to pull away. I wanted to tell him that I still hated him for the cage he represented, but my body betrayed me. I leaned into his strength, my hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of the heart I had restarted. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely a breath. "Now," Silas said, his hand moving from my arm to the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "We stop pretending. You are not my prisoner, and you are not just my mate. You are the oracle of the Black Ice Pack, and tomorrow we show the Resistance and the Sanctuary what happens when the storm and the wolf hunt together."
Before I could answer, the heavy door groaned. The Pathfinder slipped in, his expression grim. He didn't look at Silas. He looked straight at me. "The border is breached," he said, his voice urgent. "But it's not the Seekers. It's a resistance war party. They saw the mountain fall, and they think Silas has murdered you. They're not coming to rescue you, Elara. They're coming to execute the Alpha and take back their property." Silas stood up in one fluid, predatory motion, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the blade at his hip. The moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the king who would burn the world to keep what was his. "Let them come," Silas growled, his eyes flaring blue. "I've been looking for a reason to show the world that I don't bleed anymore." I stood beside him, the violet scars on my arm glowing in the firelight. I wasn't the girl who had run from a window in the sanctuary. I was something new, something dangerous. "They're not just coming for him, Pathfinder," I said, my voice cold and clear. "They're coming for the Oracle, and they're about to find out I've stopped listening to everyone's orders." Chapter 19. The Ash and the Iron. The war horns of the Resistance didn't sound like the Sanctuary's trumpets. They were hollow, haunting blasts made from the horns of mountain goats, a sound that seemed to emerge from the stone itself. I stood on the ramparts of Kale's Hold, the wind whipping my hair across my face. Beside me, Silas was a shadow of absolute focus. He had donned his black steel pauldron, and the obsidian blade at his hip hummed with a low, hungry vibration. Below, at the edge of the tree line, 100 figures emerged from the mist. They wore the mottled grays and whites of the high forest. They weren't an army of soldiers. They were hunters, marksmen, and saboteurs. "They've brought the Skyfire," the Pathfinder muttered, leaning over the stone battlement. His eyes were fixed on the strange, brass-bound canisters carried by the lead scouts. "What is it?" I asked, my fingers tracing the violet lines on my arm. "Alchemical fire," Silas growled. "It doesn't burn with wood. It burns with magic. They intend to level this village to get to you, Elara." A single rider stepped forward, a woman with hair as white as the snow and a face scarred by old frostbite. She raised a hand, and the horns went silent. "Alpha Silas!" she cried, her voice carrying through the thin mountain air. "You hold a daughter of the revolution. You hold a soul that belongs to the people, not to a crown. Release the Oracle, or we will turn this mountain into a pyre." Silas stepped onto the crenellation, his voice booming without effort. "She is not a prisoner. She is the mate of the Black Ice, and she has already chosen her side." The woman laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "A mate bond is just another leash, Alpha. If she won't come willingly, we will fulfill the prophecy of the broken thread. Better a dead oracle than a puppet one." The world went still for a heartbeat. "The broken thread?" I whispered, turning to the Pathfinder. "What does that mean?" He didn't look at me. He was staring at the woman below. "It means, if we can't control the seer, we end the line, so the sanctuary can never use it again." "You knew!" Silas hissed, his hand flying to his throat. "You knew they didn't come to rescue her. You brought us here as a target." "I brought her to the only man who could fight them!" Pathfinder choked out, his face turning purple. "I'm a scout, not an executioner. My faction wanted her free. Her faction wants her erased." "Ah! Incoming!" a sentry screamed. The canisters hissed. Orbs of brilliant, neon-green fire arched through the sky, trailing thick black smoke. They slammed into the wooden gates and the thatched roofs of the outer village. The fire didn't spread like normal flame. It lunged, seeking out the magical signatures of the wolves and the stones. "Get her to the Great Hall!"
Silas commanded, shoving Pathfinder aside and grabbing my shoulders. No, I said, my voice cutting through the panic. They're using magic seeker fire. If I hide in the hall, I'll just lead the fire to the healers and the children. I'm the one they want. I looked at the gold and violet lines on my arm. They were pulsing frantically, sensing the alchemical threat.
Silas, you have to hold the gate, I said, my eyes beginning to glow with a fierce, unstable light. I'm going to ground the fire.
Elara, you haven't recovered from the siphon.
Then help me!
I grabbed his hand, lacing my fingers with his. Use the bond. Give me your strength, and I'll give you the storm. Silas hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then his jaw set. He pulled me into his chest, his arms wrapping around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. I felt his power, massive, raw, and ancient, pour into me through the connection. It felt like a dam breaking.
I raised both hands toward the falling green orbs. I didn't try to push them away. I reached out and called to them. I made myself the most attractive target in the valley.
Come to me, I whispered. The green fire veered midair. Dozens of orbs shifted their trajectory, screaming toward the ramparts where we stood. The villagers below watched in terror as the fire converged on a single point. The moment the fire touched the aura of my light, I didn't let it burn. I used the violet poison still in my veins, the blood blight, as a filter. The rot fed on the alchemical fire, neutralizing the green heat and turning it into a harmless, shimmering mist of silver ash. A shock wave of energy rippled out from us, extinguishing the fires on the roofs and knocking the resistance hunters off their feet. I stood in the center of a whirlwind of ash, my hair glowing, my skin shimmering with the combined light of a king and a seer. Ah!
I am nobody's property,
I screamed, the sound echoing off the peaks.
Down below, the woman on the horse looked up in horror. She realized too late that she wasn't fighting a broken girl. She was fighting a new kind of power, one that the Sanctuary and the Resistance had both spent centuries trying to prevent.
"Kill them!" she shrieked, signaling her archers.
"Kill them both!" Silas roared, the sound of a wolf that had finally found its pack. He vaulted over the rampart, his obsidian blade glowing with blue frost, heading straight for the front lines.
And for the first time, I didn't hide. I raised my hand, the silver ash swirling around my fingers like a cloak, and followed him into the fray. Chapter 20. The Silver and the Steel. The snow was no longer white. It was a chaotic canvas of scorched black earth, green alchemical stains, and the deep, guttural blue of Silas's frost magic.
Silas was a whirlwind of rhythmic violence. Every swing of his obsidian blade sent a wave of freezing pressure through the air, shattering the Resistance's silver-tipped arrows before they could reach the skin of his men. But he wasn't fighting alone. Through the bond, I felt his pulse, not as a separate rhythm, but as the drumbeat to my own power. I descended the rampart steps, not as a fugitive, but as a queen of the storm. "Focus on the lines, Elara!" Silas's voice boomed through the chaos. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly where I was. "They're trying to circle."
The woman with the frostbitten face, the Resistance commander, leveled a heavy, steam-hissing crossbow at Silas's back. She didn't care about a fair fight. She wanted the king's head.
I didn't think. I didn't pray. I simply reached out and tugged at the violet threads of the blight, still humming in my marrow. "Enough!" I cried.
The air between me and the commander didn't just vibrate. It folded. A wall of silver ash and violet lightning erupted from the ground, intercepting the bolt. The metal projectile hit the barrier and disintegrated into dust.
I walked through the mist, my eyes burning with a light so bright it cast long, flickering shadows against the trees. The resistance fighters recoiled, their weapons dipping. They had spent their lives fighting puppets of the sanctuary, fragile girls who bled silver and wept. They were not prepared for a woman who wore her scars like armor. I reached the commander! Silas was there a second later, his blade humming at her throat, but he stopped. He looked at me, waiting. The transition was complete. He was no longer the one making the final call. "You call us property," I said, my voice low and lethal, echoing in the sudden silence of the battlefield. "You call the bond a leash. But you came here to kill a woman because you couldn't control her. How are you any different from the High Priestess?" "We do what is necessary for the revolution," the woman spat, though her eyes were wide with terror. "The Oracle is too powerful to be left in the hands of a wolf." "Then it's a good thing I'm in no one's hands," I said. I raised my hand, the violet lightning dancing between my fingers. I could have ended her. I could have turned her to ash right there in the snow. I felt Silas's bloodlust through the bond, a dark, hungry urge to finish the threat. But I also felt his restraint, his willingness to let me choose. I lowered my hand. The lightning dissipated into the cold air. "Go," I commanded. "Tell your leaders that the North has a new law. The Oracle is not a prize to be stolen. She is the storm that guards the gate. If you come again, I won't just ground the fire. I'll send it back." Silas withdrew his blade, the blue frost smoking in the air. "You heard her," he growled. "Run, before I change my mind." They fled. The resistance melted back into the pines, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone and the ruins of their pride. The new status quo. As the sun began to set, casting long, amber shadows over the blood-stained snow, Silas turned to me. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a heavy, profound silence. He reached out, his hand hesitating before he gently cupped my face. His thumb brushed over the faint violet lines that had now permanently traced their way up to my cheekbone. "You didn't kill her," he said. It wasn't a question, nor a reproach. It was an observation of something he didn't quite understand. "I'm tired of blood, Silas," I whispered, leaning into his touch. "If we're going to survive what's coming, we can't be the monsters they want us to be." Silas looked out over his village, the fires being extinguished, his people emerging from their homes, looking at us with a mixture of fear and newfound hope. He looked back at me, and for the first time, the mask of the High Alpha completely shattered. "I came for an instrument," he admitted, his voice a raw, honest rasp. "I found a mate, but I think I ended up with a destiny I'm not strong enough to carry alone." He didn't pull me into a cage. We stood together, shoulder to shoulder, not as a king and not as an oracle, but as two people bound by the twin frost bond, the bond this kingdom had not seen for centuries, the natural union between a true alpha and an oracle. We were no longer two separate lives bound by a curse. We were a single, devastating force. The slow burn had finally caught fire, and as the stars began to bleed into the sky, I knew that the sanctuary's walls wouldn't be enough to stop us. "Tomorrow, we prepare," Silas said, his hand sliding down to interlace his fingers with mine. "For what?" I asked. "For the priestess," he said, his eyes flashing with a final, lethal spark of blue. "She's coming for her property. It's time we showed her that the North belongs to the storm." And that brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for listening all the way through. We hope this audiobook kept you entertained and left you wanting more.
If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what kind of stories you'd like to hear next. There are plenty more full audiobooks waiting for you here, so be sure to check out the channel for your next great listen. Until next time, happy listening.